Hello, everyone. Thank you and welcome for joining us today for Let's Talk 2020 Census, counting all of rural North Carolina. I'd like to especially thank the State Library of North Carolina for hosting these sessions, and I hope everyone will enjoy the conversation. It's important to remember that the U.S. Census happens once every 10 years, and while the goal is very simple, to count everyone once, only once, and in the right place, the process can be complicated and confusing. To help us understand the process for counting our rural communities, we're lucky to have our colleague Brandy Bynum Dawson from the North Carolina Rural Center with us today. Brandy is the Rural Center's Director of Advocacy and also leads their Rural Counts Advocacy Program. She's an asset to our discussion today, having played a key role in census promotion throughout the state. Today's question and answer is being recorded, and this session with supporting resources will be posted on the State Library's YouTube channel. This question and answer session is just that. If you have a question, please use the chat feature. This is located near the bottom center of your screen. Click on chat and you will be able to type your questions in the window that pops up. Brandy will begin with an initial summary of what's happening with the census in rural North Carolina, and then I'll offer some initial questions to get the conversation started. Please feel free to enter your questions in the chat at any time. Now, as we all know, the U.S. Census, the 2020 Census is ongoing right now. Census workers began going door to door for non-response follow-up on August 11th. At that time, over 40% of North Carolina households had not responded to the 2020 census. That translates to 1.6 million households, or over 4 million North Carolinians had not been counted as of August 11th. What that means in terms of good data is obviously very threatening. If we don't know who the North Carolina people are, we can't serve their needs. But also more importantly, with $1,823 per person per year in funding tied to census numbers, that 4 million North Carolinians that have not been counted risks $7.4 billion annually in funding coming back into our communities to serve the needs of the people of North Carolina. So that's what's at stake with the census, and we only have about 5 weeks left to count all those additional 4 million people. So that's the challenge before us. I'm excited to have Brandy here with us today to give us some pointers about what we can do, what's at stake for rural North Carolina, and how we can make the census work for the rural parts of North Carolina. Now, I'd like to officially welcome Brandy Bynum Dawson as the Director of Advocacy and leader for the Rural Counts Advocacy Program. Brandy is responsible for working with diverse networks of state and federal policymakers, local leaders, and rural champions. Brandy.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bob, and to the team for this invitation to join today's conversation. We, of course, at the North Carolina Rural Center wholeheartedly believe in all this great work and are doing our best part, I'll say, to ensure that every North Carolinian, especially rural North Carolinians, are counted in the 2020 census. And I do have a short presentation that I wanted to share, and so I will share my screen. Here we are. So with that, again, I bring you greetings from the North Carolina Rural Center, where our mission and aim is to advocate and to promote, develop, and implement strategies toward economic development for the betterment and the quality of rural life in North Carolina for rural North Carolinians. We serve the state's 80 rural counties with a special focus on individuals with low to moderate incomes and communities with limited resources. We've been doing this work for over 30 years and are committed to all rural North Carolina. So you might be asking yourself, what is rural North Carolina? How is it defined? So we at the Rural Center define rural for our state. We consider the 80 counties across the state that have an average population density of 250 people per square mile or less. So per our definition, that means that North Carolina has 80 counties across the state that are considered rural. So also at the North Carolina Rural Center, we work on a number of issues, have a number of foci area as well. Everything from engagement, our leadership development work, our advocacy work, which is a program that I lead, our leadership work, our lending work, so getting capital into the hands of our small businesses across the state, and also our research, right? Having very data-driven, research-based information to make the case for rural and to be able to engage our elected officials and policymakers by utilizing that data and research. So Rural Counts is the program that, again, I mentioned earlier that I lead, and we have multiple strategies that we use to engage rural North Carolinians across the state to become and to remain rural advocates. So convening and connecting people. So what that means is really bringing people together, various and diverse voices across the table, across the political and geographic spectrum, and connect them to one another. We want to make sure that we're advancing the rural narrative across our state. We want to do that by equipping and engaging our rural folks to become advocates and to engage in that conversation at that level. So we do that in multiple ways. We provide training and resources to our rural advocates, providing them with information about topics they find relevant to them, and also education and advocacy. So we're all about moving systemic issues as it relates to addressing root causes impacting rural North Carolina and rural North Carolinians. So with that, we want to educate and engage policymakers at every level. So just a couple of key facts about the 2020 census, and a lot of the folks in the call, hopefully you're pretty well versed in this information, but just as a reminder that according to definitions as determined by, I think, the NC Complete Count Commission and the NC Counts Coalition, there are 15 counties across the state that they've identified as high risk, hard to count, hard to reach communities. Now that is by a number of factors that have surmised that definition. Everything from geography, demographics, that type of information, right? So age of population, lack of access to broadband obviously is a huge potential opportunity and detriment, I would say, to access in the census form. So these are some communities that have been identified as high risk and hard to reach. And so we have definitely, I'll talk about an example of work that we have done, really targeted outreach on the ground to engage those particular communities and those community leaders. So North Carolina not only has a moral imperative to ensure that every North Carolinian is counted, but also a demographic imperative as well. As you'll see from this slide here, that there's been significant population change across rural North Carolina in particular. You see the counties highlighted in the high pink or high colored pink or almost red for that matter. There are 15 counties between 2010 and 2018 that have considerably lost population, right? People have moved out of those communities. I am from rural northeastern North Carolina. I moved out, right? I went off to college. I did end up coming back for a number of years, but those are some of the examples of the population shift and changes over time. That again really speaks to the necessity and the critical nature of ensuring that every North Carolinian, especially folks in rural North Carolina, are counted where they live and where they are. In addition, we've also seen additional demographic changes population-wise, that our Hispanic population across the state is steadily increasing, which is phenomenal and it's great, leads to a more diverse state here in North Carolina. That also brings opportunities as well. And so we're excited about that population change, but definitely want to acknowledge the differences in demographics across our state, but again, between 2010 and 2018. So why does the census matter for rural North Carolina? I think the same reasons are relevant to the entire state as a whole and to our entire country, but particularly for rural North Carolina. We know that, and Bob stated this very elegantly before we started, is that there's a lot of federal funding at stake for our communities and our counties across the state. This is funding that is contributed to our facilities, healthcare facilities, our roads, our infrastructure, other aspects of community economic development. And for rural North Carolina in particular, we cannot stand to lose $1, let alone 1 cent, right? We know that those funding will really help to move the needle for rural North Carolina. And when we don't receive those funds, it goes somewhere else, right? So we want to make sure that money comes home and comes home to rural North Carolina. Again, for community economic development and planning, businesses use census data to determine where they're going to start a business, right? They use it to determine what type of products they're going to innovate and to implement. And so having an accurate census count data lets us know who's there, how many people are there, and where there's opportunity for profitability. And last but not least, and definitely very important, is political representation. With an accurate census count, North Carolina stands to gain an additional seat, in the U.S. House of Representatives, right? And so what that means for rural is greater representation, greater influence, and greater opportunity for policymaker engagement. And I'll go a little bit deeper on the census and community economic development. So again, census data is used to help determine how public money is invested. And so what that means is that we don't have an accurate count. We don't know exactly how those funds can be used, right? And so we're in the midst of a global pandemic. That money is really, really important, as we saw through the CARES Act dollars that were funded to our state and ultimately funneled to some of our local communities. And without accurate census data, we won't know how many people are actually in need, therefore being able to access or not access that funding. Again, businesses use data to determine where they're going to locate and what products they're going to offer. Local government uses census data to determine the community needs, infrastructure-wise especially. And again, political representation. I can't harp on this one enough. It's really important. Again, more representation means more influence. We also know that in 2020, that census data is going to be used to redraw district lines here in North Carolina. And so, as I mentioned earlier, while the North Carolina Rural Center does have a very strong statewide strategy towards engagement around rural outreach, in particular as it relates to the census, we also have done and conducted some targeted outreach in key rural communities across the state. I think we've all read the news. You've seen the numbers that of the 50th lowest response counties in the state so far, and thanks to Carolina Demography for such great weekly data, which is really great data to help us motivate folks and also have more direct engagement, that those 50 counties are all rural, right? And so we do have a lot more work to do to engage. And so with that engagement, we've identified a number of strategies that we have felt like are really localized and allow local communities to really engage at a much deeper level. So we have been able to engage a number of local governments across the state. There are utility bills that still go out, right? And so with that, there's an opportunity to put an insert or messaging around the census and utility bill inserts. And we've seen that really work in a couple of local communities. We've also noted that some county managers and county commissioners have partnered on co-authored op-eds as well, as a way just really to have a strong call to action and utilizing local papers to bring that message home and try to reach as many constituents as possible. Also, I think condoning this and supporting this and safest ways possible, where people are frequenting. We know as a result of the pandemic that a number of our rural North Carolinians and North Carolinians in general are in need of a lot of additional services, food, for example. And so we've noticed that a lot of our churches and a lot of community-based organizations are providing census information at food drives. We're, of course, encouraging them to do that in socially distancing appropriate ways, but it's also a way to reach a high number of people in a high traffic area in a short amount of time. So really getting out the message and utilizing those ways and opportunities where people are already engaging. In addition, the U.S. Census Bureau does support communities and institutions in hosting what they call mobile questionnaire assistance centers. Again, we're also encouraging practicing social distancing, but these are partnership with local organizations that have that reach, your churches, your community-based institutions that are able to set up laptops and computers and support people in completing the census right where they are. Now, with that, I do want to acknowledge, we know that we do have a lack of broadband access, whether just across the board, but also limited access as well. So having these centers that can support completion immediately and completely right there on site has been a really valuable tool across rural North Carolina. Also, we're in an age and days of social media, so utilizing social media, Instagram, Facebook, things of that nature to really be able to get the message out to as many people as possible. We've seen a lot of really great creativity when it comes to that. In addition, utilizing opportunities such as mass text or email blasts, those good old methods still work. They're dark ways of engaging with folks. And so we've noticed a lot of our churches are actually engaging in that, right? So they're engaging with their congregants to remind them of church services. They're also hosting weekly services. And so we've encouraged them to also be sure to send out a message about the census in those weekly text message or email blasts as well. So those are definitely some, what I would say, tried or true methods that we have learned from our community partners and supporting them and also implementing. And I know there's probably some questions in the chat, but happy to have a conversation here. But for more information about the Rural Center in general, also the work that we're doing around engagement around the census, here's my contact information. Feel free to follow us here as well. And I'm happy to answer any questions that may have come through already.
Brandy, thanks for that presentation. There's a lot of great information, a lot of great perspective coming from the rural side of North Carolina, which, as you mentioned, is most of North Carolina geographically. So it's a key component, and we do want to stress that the 2020 census, again, the task is to count everyone, rural, urban, young, old, all ages, all races, everyone counts in the census. So thanks for that. As just to remind folks, if you have questions for Brandy or myself, please enter those in the chat area and we'll get to those very soon. Brandy, you brought up a couple of very important points and I did want to ask a couple of questions. And you covered this on a high level in terms of representation and funding and good planning data. But can you talk a little bit about some of the other motivating factors, maybe for rural North Carolina, why they should really make sure that they're counted? You mentioned that a lot of the response rates for areas that are lagging in the state tend to be in rural areas. Why might that be? And why should rural North Carolina really step up and be counted during this time?
Yeah, we've noted, I do want to also acknowledge that of the 80 counties that we identify as rural, there are 4.1 million people that call rural North Carolina home here in our state, right? So that's a significant number of individuals across the state. So, there's definitely an economic imperative ensuring that there's an accurate census count. Like I mentioned earlier, I think particularly for rural communities that tend to be under-resourced, ensuring that when needs such as a pandemic, such as a natural disaster, ensuring that we have an accurate census count so those federal funding dollars come to communities that are needed the most, right? And so with that also goes political representation. So with our 80 counties and where there's a lot of geographic representation opportunity, it really matters greatly to make sure we have an accurate census count. The census will help determine how many rural legislators will represent rural communities, right? And so where we know there's representation, there's influence. And when there's not, there's a lack thereof. And so ensuring that our rural North Carolinians have an opportunity to engage with their elected officials, we have to make sure we have an accurate count to make sure that we have that type of representation here, locally, at the school board level, at the county commissioner level, at the state legislator level, and at the federal level as well.
That's great. And you brought up so much there to point out. First of all, the census is something that happens once every 10 years, but it is that most complete picture that we get of our communities. And even especially in a COVID environment, and just in recent weeks, we've had an earthquake and a hurricane impact our state. Census data is going to help us assess the impact of things like storms, emergency situations, and it's going to help us better assess and better respond to those things. So if we want North Carolina to more nimbly and in a better informed fashion respond to those things, we have to have good data on who our population is. And that's what census data provides. And as you pointed out with the maps that you've shown, North Carolina is a rapidly growing state. We're the 9th largest state in terms of total population, but in terms of the rate of growth, we're the 4th fastest growing state in the nation. We're growing by about a net of 100,000 people a year, and we've been doing that for the past 25 to 30 years. Mm-hmm. So it's a very dynamic state. We're growing by about the size of Wilmington every year. So knowing what that growth looks like, are these seniors who are retiring to North Carolina? Are they young families who are moving to North Carolina with children who are going to be in the school system? Are there folks who are being deployed to North Carolina as part of their military service? Are they students who are coming to school here? The census data informs that, and that's the type of information that all of our community leaders need to be able to better serve their communities. And you mentioned the challenges, your call to outreach to community leaders. Can we know that we've got about 5 weeks left to make sure everyone is counted. We know that census workers are going door to door. You talked about the challenges of broadband, but are there other ways that people can be counted on the census if they don't have internet or they'd rather not use the internet? What are their options?
Yes, that's a great question, Bob, and a great point to make is that there are two additional ways for folks to complete the census. So if you don't have access to the internet, let alone the technology, to be able to complete your census online, there are additional ways. So by phone, I think the census, there are 59 language assistance numbers that you can call to support you in whatever your primary language may be to complete the census. Also, there's a good old fashioned mail, right? And so you can also mail in your form if you did receive a form in the mail. We're really encouraging people as much as possible as where it's available for them to complete it online because it happens right there immediately, or to do so by phone. We've also noticed, quite honestly, Bob, that in a lot of our rural communities that tend to be older, is that individuals are having a little bit of challenges completing the census, just in general, not even just online. And so it's really going to be necessary for our faith-based community-based organizations and local government to come together and support our seniors kind of where they are. Doing again in a socially distant, safe manner, but also providing avenues and vessels and vehicles for people to complete the census and have some assistance in being able to do so.
That's great. And you're stressing good points that this isn't just a local government issue. It's not a state government issue. It's not a federal government issue. The impact of the census is very local. It's a community issue. So it's going to impact those preschool and after school lunch programs. It's going to affect job training. It's going to affect English as a second language classes. So many programs that really serve community needs. So you participate in the census because it helps your neighborhood, it helps your community, it brings your tax dollars back to serve your needs, and that's critical. I should point out now, we mentioned that the census workers are going door to door starting now, and they'll be doing that through the end of data collection, which is September 30th. So September 30th is our census deadline. But as those census workers are going door to door, we are still in a COVID environment and we want everyone to be safe. The census workers will be wearing masks. They will have gloves. They will be properly identified. We don't want anyone being taken advantage of by scammers. So they will have photo IDs, visible badges with their picture and the expiration date on it. They'll be carrying messenger bags with the Census Bureau logo. They'll be clearly marked. They will not ask to come into your home. They will stay socially distant as they stand on the doorstep or 6 feet apart and ask the basic questions. And speaking of the basic questions, we want folks to recognize it's 10 very basic questions. Your housing situation, do you own or rent? The name, age, race, sex, Hispanic origin, and family relationship of each person in the household. So it's not just the homeowner, but it's all the children, spouses, grandparents, anyone else that's in the household, everyone counts. It's important to note that there is also no citizenship question on the census. There was some discussion of that during the preparation time for the census, but on the 2020 census, there is no citizenship question. So Brandy, another question is, in rural North Carolina, we have a lot of seasonal farm workers, or there's mobile labor that is frequently rotating through Eastern North Carolina. And at this time of the year, we're at harvest time. Are those folks included in the census count? And what do farm owners or rural North Carolinians need to know about making sure that everyone's counted?
Yes, if they are a resident of North Carolina, the census date has shifted, right, as a result of COVID and other things. And so if they are a resident of North Carolina, then they do need to complete the census where they are. And I would say that, farm workers definitely need to ensure that they're completing it, but having the supports to be able to do so. And I think that's where the employers come into play, is because what's going to be advantageous for that individual is going to be advantageous ultimately for the community and for the state as a whole. So it definitely is, I would say, a moral imperative for employers to make sure every employee is counted and every person in that employee's household is actually counted as well. So it's, it's really beneficial for everyone across the state to ensure that not just your household, but everyone else's household is also counted in the census. So what you're learning here, what you've heard already, share it with someone. Don't keep it to yourself. We really need to get the word out as much as possible and to as many people as possible. We know at the Rural Center is that there's a shared fate between rural, urban, and suburban communities in North Carolina. And this is demonstrated all too well by the economic impact of an accurate census count, right? From the foods we buy, the roads we drive on, the schools we send our children to, and the quality of the education they receive, the jobs we create or retain, all of these things depend on an accurate count. And all of these things transcend party, geographic, and demographic lines. I just say, simply put, the cost of an undercount are just too great to ignore, especially now.
That's a great point. I've heard it stated before too that the census is an investment. So we are going to pay for the census either by investing and making sure that everyone is counted, or by having bad data and having poor decisions based on bad data for the next 10 years.
Right.
Because there won't be another census until 2030. So it's vital that everyone gets on board with this. Again, if folks have questions, please use the chat feature and enter those, and we'll be glad to get those asked and answered. We did mention the option earlier of if folks don't have internet access or choose not to use the internet, the phone numbers for folks to be able to call in their responses. In English, the phone number is 844-330-2020. And for Spanish language response, it is 844-468-2020. There are other languages that are available. There is a link in the chat window. And again, all these links will be provided later. So if you would like to respond in Chinese, in other languages, those options are there. The important thing to remember is that you can respond online, by phone, or by the paper questionnaire if you already have it. You can do that inside your home right now. And avoid any contact in an era of COVID. But the important thing is that you be counted. It's quick, it's easy, it's safe, and it's important. So we need everyone on board with that. I appreciate Brandy doing such a great job of deputizing everyone who's listening right now. You are now challenged to go forward and spread the word. Brandy, we did mention, we were just talking about seasonal farm labor, and there are folks, and even if they're not seasonal farm workers, there are people who wonder, well, you know, I'm a little hesitant about providing some of this information to a government agency. How is my information going to be used? You know, how safe is it? Am I going to get audited? Am I going to get jury duty by responding to the census? Can you talk a little bit about how safe the process is?
Yeah, so I can speak from my own personal, perspective. I'll definitely say and sort of add that in. Obviously I completed the census for our household and kind of walk my husband through the process as well. Like, this is kind of what it is. We're advocates for completion of it. These are the questions that are asked, and it's completely safe, right? I mean, it takes about 5 to 10 minutes for you to complete it. And the information is used, again, to help determine a lot of things, right? The data that's used from the census help us know kind of who our employers are, the number of residents in our state. That helps to allocate, again, federal resources, political representation. So it really is safe, and it's upward for safe for an individual for over 70 years, right? I know folks are also using census data to track their lineage as well. And so it's really a great opportunity to ensure that if we have that accurate information, we're able to determine that information and have access to that data for years and years to come. To a point that you made earlier, Bob, is that, again, the census only happens every 10 years. And this means that we have an undercount today, we will be underfunded tomorrow and every year until the next census, which won't happen until 2030. So it's really, really imperative that we make sure that every person is counted here in our state.
Absolutely. And you bring up some good points there about the genealogical research. From a legal standpoint, the census is required in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 2. I think it's the 5th or 6th sentence of the Constitution. So the founding fathers felt this was really important to have a representative form of government. We have to know who we're representing. And the census is the way of determining who we're representing. So we have to count all the residents of each state every 10 years. That's what the census is. But there are underlying federal laws that tell us how the census will be conducted and that protect census confidentiality. So Title 13 of the U.S. Code states that your individual census information can't be shared with any government agency, any individual, not anyone, not law enforcement, the courts, immigration, the IRS, not even your parents. So they can't share your individual census responses for 72 years. So what can get shared, they can say in this county or in this city or in this part of the county, there are 100 people who rent their homes. They can't say that the person that lives at 123 Main Street is a renter. That's the difference. So they'll release basic summary information, but they can't release individual information. That individual information is protected for 72 years. Violation of that confidentiality is punishable by 5 years in federal prison and or $250,000 fine. So the penalties are very severe. So the latest data that's available from the Census for Individuals is the 1940 census. In 2022, the 1950 individual census information will be released. And the State Library of North Carolina has a fantastic genealogy collection. So for folks who are doing family histories, I encourage you to visit the State Library of North Carolina, check out their resources. And in 2022, that 1950 census data will be available. Let's see. In terms of the non-response follow-up, I do want to mention we did state that they will be wearing the masks and they will be wearing the protective gear, the gloves, and they'll have hand sanitizer. We talked a little bit about what the census asks, the basic questions that those door-to-door enumerators will be asking. We do want to make folks aware that of what the census will not be asking. Because there have been some scam attempts already in North Carolina, and we want everyone to be protected. The census will never ask for credit card numbers, account numbers. They will not ask for social security numbers. They will not ask for cash donations, and they will not ask for anything on behalf of a political party. So if you are contacted or if someone comes to your door saying they're with the Census Bureau and they ask for that type of information, be wary. That's most likely a scam. So are there some unique challenges in the COVID environment that are maybe a little bit more pronounced in the rural parts of the state that may not be as common in say, a Charlotte or Raleigh or Greensboro?
Yeah, I would definitely say one of the key challenges, and being a person from rural North Carolina, I would say it's definitely been my experience is that communities are so spread out, which I think is beneficial in a COVID environment, right? For people to be spread out and socially distanced, literally, right, across communities, but also it provides challenges when getting from one community to another, right? So information sharing purposes, if people aren't out in high traffic areas, it definitely limits the number of interactions they're going to have, therefore limiting the amount of information people are going to be able to receive. And so having the multiple avenues and vehicles and vessels for people to receive information has really been really critical, I would say, in this COVID-19 environment. So social media, traditional media has been also, as well as really opportunistic at the same time. As well as just kind of the word of mouth. So, having phone conversations, the text messaging chains, really encouraging people to have the information. That's definitely been a challenge, I'll say, Bob, as far as transportation. People aren't coming out. People don't have access to ways to come out of their communities and come out of their homes. And so finding ways to get the information to people where they're going to best receive it.
That's great. We mentioned that there are the three ways of responding to the census. We know that internet access has been a challenge in rural communities. I do want to point out to our attendees that before COVID hit, the strategy had been to utilize places like public libraries were going to be access points that people could go to in their communities and use those resources. Brandy has mentioned the mobile questionnaire assistance centers that a lot of local communities are leveraging with the census staff. That's a key component of being able to respond online if you'd like to. But Governor Cooper has also made available some Wi-Fi hotspots. Those were distributed to public school systems. So if you, there's a link on the North Carolina Complete Count Commission website, that's census.nc.gov. That will provide a link to the individual school systems, and you can find out where those hotspots are. These are being placed in school buses, and some of them are traveling throughout the districts. So you don't necessarily have to go a long distance. You can just go to where those school buses are, access the Wi-Fi hotspots. Maybe while you're downloading school information for remote learning for your students, you can also be counted in the census. So we want to let folks know that there is an effort to make sure that there are easy ways for you to be counted in your own community. Brandy, I've heard some issues with folks who live in rural areas that don't really receive mail delivered to their door. They have mail through P.O. boxes. Did that have any impact on how census information was distributed?
Yes, most definitely. There was a lot of confusion amongst community members about, they were hearing messages about they should have received a form, they should have received information at that point, and they had not. One local community I can think of that has a population of only 200 people, 200 amazing people at that, right? And so all of whom utilized a PO box. And so they had not received anything, about the census at that point. And so we were trying to support them in understanding the process regarding when the information would be sent out, how they would receive their forms. And we heard that a lot across rural North Carolina. Where I'm from, I grew up with a PO box, right? And so, of course, my family has heard from me at this point how important the census completion is, and they've all done it online already. But nonetheless, it's an example of people not having access to the mail right there at their front door, that having to go to the PO box, and sort of the process and the length of time, I would say, that it's actually taken for the information to come through, and had really been a challenge for a lot of folks. So that was one of the ideas regarding, again, having sort of census completion days in communities. So those same individuals would come out actually and have access to a laptop, a tablet, or a computer to complete the census that way, and having some support in being able to do so. So just really having to pivot and shift, quite honestly, and not waiting for the information to come, but also taking the necessary steps in the initiative to make sure people are going to be able to support them and getting the information where they are and completing the actual census at that time.
Fantastic. Yeah. And just to let folks know, the reason, part of the issue here is that, remember, the census is required for drawing congressional districts and precincts and all that. So the task of the census is to count everyone where they usually live. No one actually lives at a PO box. So we can't draw a congressional district or a voting precinct around a PO box. So the task of that, the Census Bureau did not mail information to PO boxes. They have an operation called Update Leave, where in areas where folks rely on PO boxes, census workers were going to come out and leave census materials on doorknobs. Unfortunately, COVID interrupted that operation. It was delayed, and it just concluded, the drop-off of information concluded in early to mid-July. So obviously COVID had an impact on census timelines. That's why originally the Census Bureau had extended the response period to October 31st. However, the Census Bureau is governed by some federal laws that require data to be released. State populations for apportionment of seats in the House of Representatives have to be provided to the president by December 31st of the census year. So that's December 31st of 2020, with redistricting information beginning to be released to the states on April 1st of the year following the census. So that's 2021. Now, the Census Bureau, understanding the impact of COVID, requested a delay on those deadlines. However, the Senate and Congress have failed to approve that. So the Census Bureau is stuck with using the pre-COVID release dates, which is December 31st, 2020 for apportionment, April 1st for redistricting. And because of that, to meet those deadlines, the Census Bureau had to shorten their data collection period. So while you may have heard that October 31st was the census deadline, it's actually September 30th now. So we don't want anyone to be confused. If you are in one of these rural areas where you just now have received your packet of information hung on your doorknob, or even if you didn't receive that packet hung on your doorknob, you don't need that packet. You can go online right now at my2020census.gov. You'll notice that on that website, it asks for a census ID code. If you don't have that code, there's a link where you can just click that. It says, I don't have a code. And you can input your address and be counted that way. So the important thing is make the effort for the investment of a couple of minutes of your time. You're bringing an awful lot of resources for the future of your community back to your neighborhood. If you don't have the internet at home, if you'd rather not use the internet, again, we posted the phone numbers, so you can use those as well. So Brandy, as we get ready to wrap up, I'm still keeping an eye on the chat window. And again, I just want to let folks know if you have specific questions for Brandy or me, please put those in the chat area, and we'll be glad to answer those as best we can. Are there any unique challenges? We've talked about the broadband access issue. We've talked about some of the geographic issues in counting rural North Carolina. Are there other unique challenges to a rural North Carolina that may not be associated with our more metro or urban areas?
Yeah, I definitely know, looking at the data, and I think the lack of response or under response, I'll say, quite honestly, in the 50 lowest response rate counties, all of which are rural, you look at those counties and you notice a trend, right? So they're either far west or they're in the east, right? And so, opportunities, I'll say, with vacationers, which is great for our rural economy, for our economy as a whole. Those people don't actually live in our state, 365 days out of the year. And so undercount, a lot of what we're seeing out in the western part of the state is as a result of those vacation homes. Same thing that we're seeing also on the coast. That is definitely an additional factor. And so that definitely is a challenge for us. And we have a lovely state from the mountains to the coast, and people want to, buy here and they want to, frequent here, but they're not residents of this state 365 days out of the year. And so that definitely has brought challenge when it comes to the undercount and the lack of response in those particular communities. And we've spoken to a lot of local government officials who are saying, we're doing our best. We're getting information out there. We think we've counted everyone else, but this is just kind of the nature of where we are as a community, and sort of not having the access. Those individuals don't live strictly in our state necessarily, like I said, 365 days out of a year. So that definitely has been a challenge, I'll say, with this census as in past years as well.
That's a key component, and it's a great thing to point out because as you pointed out, we live in a fantastic state with a lot of great opportunities for getting outside and enjoying the beauty of our state. And a lot of folks have recognized that. That's why so many people are moving into North Carolina. It's a great place to live. But those seasonal homes in the West, if you like the mountains, if you like skiing at the beach, on the coast, those seasonal homes are just that. They're seasonal. They may be rental properties. And obviously, if that's not where people live most of the time, they're not going to be counted there. But those addresses still get census forms. So there's going to be a reason that some communities have a higher non-response rate, and that's appropriate. As the census workers are going door to door now, they're going to make adjustments for that, and we'll see some improvements in our response rates. The other thing to point out right now is the census workers, as they are going door to door, the households that they visit, the information that they're collecting may not necessarily be reflected in the response rate information that's being published every weekday online. Because what's being published online is self-response. That's the people who actually responded for themselves, and not the people that talk to the census workers. So we want to make folks aware that being counted, doing your part to fill out your census, actually maintains that distance from the census workers. So it's while the census workers are going to be wearing protective gear, it's probably safer from a social distancing standpoint to be counted yourself. The other point to point out is nobody knows more about you than you. So when you fill out your census form, you're providing the best information about how you identify. Nobody is going to tell you what race you are, how old you are, about your Hispanic origin or not. They're not even going to tell you your gender. You provide that information yourself based on how you identify. So providing that information gives us the best picture of who we're serving from a state and local perspective. So it's always better if you provide your own information. The sooner you do that, the less likely you are to be visited. So while we know response rates are going to improve as we get closer to September 30th, we don't want to take that for granted. We want everybody doing their part to be counted. We're counting for everybody who's participating right now on this to help get the word out there. I also wanted to point out a couple of issues in terms of other operations that are going on right now. We've been keying on the non-response operation, which will go on door to door through September 30th. There is also an operation to count folks that are in what we call group quarters. A group quarter situation is where folks live for an extended amount of time, but they may actually have a home somewhere else. These are places like nursing homes, college dorms, military barracks, prisons and jails, those type of things. Everyone counts on the census, even people in these situations. While the Census Bureau began counting those housing situations electronically before COVID really hit, there were some of these group quarters that chose not to respond electronically, and census workers are visiting those in person right now. So if you're in a nursing home, or if you have friends and family members who are in nursing homes, or who are at college dorms, or at military bases, these folks are going to be counted, and they may see census workers visiting them right now too. Another issue is folks who are experiencing homelessness. Those folks count too. There is a service-based enumeration operation that will be conducted from September 22nd to September 24th. Census workers will be working with folks who are local service providers through soup kitchens, homeless shelters, or folks who provide services to the homeless that are visible in the streets. So the Census Bureau staff will be making an effort to work with those folks to count the homeless population. And finally, the last field operation that's going on toward the end of September or through most of September is census workers attempting to count people in transient locations. These are places like marinas on the coast or at campgrounds, RV parks. We know there's a mobile population. There are going to be folks who are maybe hiking the Appalachian Trail. If they're staying at a campground, they count for the census. So census workers will be making an effort to count folks during that count of transient locations. And that also will be the operation that attempts to count the seasonal farm workers. So we want to make sure that everyone knows that they're important. If you're in North Carolina, no matter your age, race, sex, no matter where you're from, where you were living a year ago, regardless of your citizenship status. If you're here, you matter to North Carolina. We want to plan for your future as part of our future. So please be counted. I'm not seeing any other questions on the queue right now. Brandy, do you have any other final comments before we close our session today?
Yeah, I'll just close out, I think, with two really hopefully motivating comments, which are, one is actually data that you shared, Bob, which was really eye-opening for us at the Rural Center, which is a 3% undercount in North Carolina would ultimately cost our state more than $4 billion in funding. And that means we would lose potentially $1.8 billion in funding for our rural communities. And we can't stand to lose any of those dollars coming home to rural North Carolina. So we encourage folks, count yourself in the 2020 census and encourage others to do the same, because North Carolina's future definitely depends on it.
Brandy, thanks so much for your comments today. This has been fantastic. For anyone who's attending today, again, these resources and the presentation is being recorded and will be made available through the State Library's YouTube channel. You can see the slide on the screen right now that gives you the links to where these will be available. Obviously, if you have any questions about the census in rural areas, I would encourage you to get in touch with Brandy and the great folks at the Rural Center. If you have questions about just what's going on in rural North Carolina outside of the census, I'd recommend that you talk with Brandy and the folks at the Rural Center. They have been outstanding advocates for everything having to do with life in rural North Carolina. And as we pointed out, that's most of the counties in North Carolina fall within that category. So going forward, I do want to point out, I know we've covered this point a number of times today, but we have 5 weeks left, only 5 weeks left to count over 4 million North Carolinians. Those are our friends, our neighbors, our coworkers, our colleagues. These are people that are using the same roads, highways, water, sewer, electricity systems. They're working in the same labor force as we are. We need to plan for their future. All of these folks are important to the future of North Carolina. So we all need to be doing our part to make sure that everyone is counted. To point out again, your response to the 2020 census is required, but the census is safe, easy, and very important. It's only 10 questions. Your responses are protected for 72 years by federal law. Your information can't be shared with anyone. So the biggest risk of the census is the only way it can hurt you is if you're not counted. So we ask everyone to take a few minutes to be counted. Remember, the census deadline is September 30th, September 30th, 2020. From now till then, you can either visit my2020census.gov. You can call in English, again, that's 844-330-2020. And in Spanish, it's 844-468-2020. And there are more phone lines available in other languages if you should need those. And again, census workers are going door to door now. So if you haven't been counted, if you haven't used the internet or you don't want to use the phone, please talk to a census worker when they visit your door sometime between now and September 30th. Thanks everyone for your time, for being a part of today's presentation. Please be in contact with either myself or the folks at the North Carolina Complete Count Commission. You can reach them by visiting census.nc.gov with any questions you may have about the census in our state. Thanks everyone for your time today. Please be safe and please be counted. Thank you.